Welcome back to Science and Sports. Today I'm joined by Rob Nelson, athletic performance coach at Penn State University. Rob specializes in skill acquisition and motor learning, helping athletes in softball and swimming not just practice harder but train also smarter. Today we'll dig into how skills are really learned, why traditional drills might fall short, and how coaches can design training that sticks when it matters most. Make sure to leave a like and follow the podcast, and let's jump in. TeamBuildr is the online strength and conditioning software for performance coaches that allows you to create training programs and track progress over time for things like max back squat, jump height, or any other KPI that you collect. The free-form programming features allow you to brand and design your programs so athletes can complete them at their own pace or get extra rehab work in. The force plate and VBT integrations allow coaches to easily track KPIs that are critical for all sports. TeamBuildr Strength is currently offering a 30-day free trial when you sign up with the code EURO. Head to teambuildr.com and sign up with promo code EURO to access this exclusive offer. Welcome back to my podcast called Science and Sports. Today I have a very special guest with me here today. Rob Nelson, the athletic performance coach at Penn State University. Hi, Rob.
Hey, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. I know it's always difficult with the time difference from Europe to North America, but we made it happen. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad we can talk today a little bit about skill acquisition. Obviously, your work in the Penn State University, I'm very interested in. But first of all, thank you for joining. Can you give me a little bit of a background check of yourself, where you worked at maybe in the past, where you're working at right now, or what you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, for sure. So I won't go through every single thing because I've worked plenty of jobs over the years from that kind of standpoint. I'll kind of just talk about a little bit of the areas I've worked in. So a little bit about me. I spent a lot of my time earlier in my career working in the private sector. So currently this is going into about the 10th year of coaching for me. I started in the private sector when I was in college, kind of the first couple of years after that, managing some private facilities in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is where I'm from. I also interned at the University of Pittsburgh at that time while I was working full time. Other kind of notable stops for me, I spent a year working with an NHL organization, which is the Pittsburgh Penguins. So I spent a year doing that. I spent a year at IMG Academy working with football, baseball, and tennis. I was a graduate assistant for a year at St. Francis University, which is actually still a little bit down the road from Penn State, about an hour away. I was the interim director and assistant strength and conditioning coach at Wofford College. And most recently, before Penn State, I was the associate director of sports performance at UMBC, which is the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And now I'm an athletic performance coach at Penn State. And I also do some consulting with professional rugby in the U.S. So definitely a lot of different things going on for me.
For sure.
A lot of different background and that kind of stuff. But to your point, a lot of what I've gotten into more recently has been I guess I always try to focus on what's going to effectively create more meaningful work, right? I think a lot of times in our field, we do a lot of, it's all the grind mind, mentality and that kind of stuff. And that's not necessarily something I agree with. A lot of my philosophy now is trying to basically do more work that has more meaning, right? So that's why I've kind of dived into the skill acquisition work, the motor learning theory, and then kind of just even some of the sports science data, that kind of stuff to just kind of create some more value and inherent. Just add some value for what I do from a sports performance standpoint, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, and thanks for your brief introduction about your background. It's a lot to take in, but it's awesome to hear that you have been in a lot of different positions, so you know what you're talking about when it comes to strength and conditioning, and you've seen a lot of different angles, different perspectives on the same kind of training, if you say it in the easy way. What I'm interested in, like I mentioned in the beginning, is the skill acquisition part. What led you to focus on the skill acquisition and the motor learning part of that you picked that out from the million parts you could have also picked out to really focus on?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I always got to shout out one of my former coaches I worked with. His name's Casey Kreider. He's the head coach for volleyball at UMBC currently, and
Hmm.
he kind of introduced me to the concepts. So, Casey's he's a close friend of mine, very special person, and it was something that he introduced me to the theory and that kind of thing. But I think a lot of it too was I was at a point in my career where I was kind of ready to make a shift. Right, it was kind of one of those things where I had worked that getting athletes stronger, getting athletes more mobile, like doing all the things that I think are really like inherently celebrated in strength and conditioning, right? It's like, hey, like, oh, we got to get those, back squat numbers up. We got to get those hang clean numbers up, stuff like that. And it was all stuff that I was doing, right? I was like theoretically doing this really good job from a traditional lens of strength and conditioning. And I wasn't really seeing a lot of return on investment from what I was doing, right? I had athletes that it's like, I always use this example when I was down working with baseball at one point. I had an athlete who, all the strength numbers were going up. His mobility was increasing. Like he was doing everything right, but his batting average in baseball went down. Right. So it's like
Hmm.
realistically, it's like, and I think a lot of people like to go, well, like it's not our role, right, for when it comes to like on like, specific skill performance or whatever. But I was kind of like, what if it could be, right? What if we could have something where there's a little bit more transfer? What if we could do something where it's a little bit more inherently representative to sport? Or if there's a way that we could kind of influence the way that practice is designed or the way that things kind of should be running that makes just a little bit more sense, right? Isn't just,
Hmm.
hey, I've always done it this way, or this is what my coach did before me. And so I wanted to kind of like, after talking with Casey, and he was someone that I listened to his podcast before I took that job at UMBC. I sought out that position to work with him specifically because I knew that he could teach me a lot of things, and all the stuff that he was saying really made sense to me. So that's kind of how I got started with it. And then I've kind of just taken it, working with him extensively and other people, right, other companies and other people that are kind of involved in this kind of theory and framework, and just build it out for myself, if that makes sense.
Hmm. I'm really interested in what you said, and I think we can have a really good and deep and meaningful conversation about the motor learning skill acquisition. Like I mentioned probably 2 or 3 times already, I'm glad that you're here. I'm really interested in learning from you and um, getting some informations from you about those stages, about those protocols, about those the whole approach to it, kind of. Um, if you don't mind, I would just throw in some random words. What I researched a little bit about the different kind of frameworks, the different kind of important details to look out for when it comes to skill acquisition, and we could break it down. We could talk about those frameworks and see where the conversation leads, if that's good for you.
Yeah, that sounds great to me.
Okay, first one being motor learning principles. Rob, take a
Yeah, a
sip.
little bit of a tough one there.
Yes.
Motor learning, obviously, like I just think it's one of those things. It's a little bit of a framework when we talk about, how we decide to like learn and understand, right? So it's kind of like movement involved in that kind of thing. And so when you look at different principles, kind of like under the motor learning framework, it can be a lot of inherently different things, right? So it can look at just kind of like the way that people decide to do and act and do different things. But I think it's a little bit more of an overarching like framework, right? So for me,
Mm-hmm.
like a little bit, for me, it's kind of easier to dive into specific principles of, hey, like this is what we're talking about specifically. But when I talk about like motor learning, it's like how that body's going to adapt in a system, right? So if we look at the ecological framework or the dynamical systems theory or a lot of these kind of associated frameworks that are there, a lot of them, like you kind of go into, you break down the words or whatever ends up being. So like if I look at dynamical systems theory, it's right. So it's like dynamical systems is inherently related to the body, right? So like the
Mm-hmm.
body is this like complex, adaptable system, right? This is just a theory, right? Versus another theory that inherently looks at the body as more of like a computerized program, right? So
Yep.
it's kind of like, hey, like I see this, specific situation. I'm going to put this algorithm or program that's kind of like predetermined or pre-learned, and then I'm going to take that program and then run that program, and then I do this action, right? With dynamical systems, it's like, hey, we're constantly adapting, evolving. There's a lot of evidence to kind of support this too, that like the body isn't super stagnant in the same thing, right? It's not just constantly adapting the same thing over and over again, right? you could kind of tie some of these frameworks to like the concept of like evolution, other things like that as well over time, right? Where based on the needs or different things that you're looking to do, your body's effectively going to adapt to those situations, if that kind of makes sense. And I know that like wasn't a good overarching principle. It's just like, it's really hard to explain like motor learning principles without getting real specific, if that makes sense.
All good. I mean, I'm sitting here, you can see me, that I'm a little bit confused looking. It's not because I don't understand it, it's just hard for me to grasp it, because it's hard to get it from English to German and really get into the science behind it in real time. But like you just said, I think it starts with the cognitive stage, when I'm not mistaken, that you learn it, that you try to understand a movement or a drill, then you do the drill, and then you get feedback after the drill, and then you can change it depending on maybe like intrinsic, extrinsic feedback. You can read, or how do you say, you can work on the same movement to make it autonomous, or automatic is the word, I think, right?
Yeah, and the not to cut you off, but like it also depends on kind of the framework in which you look at, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for me, like there's two kind of like major skill acquisition theories, right? So there's what's called information processing, and then there's ecological dynamics, right? So information processing has what's called indirect perception, so which is kind of like what I alluded to earlier, where I basically like I'm looking for clues in the environment. Right. So this is like personally like not what I agree with, just to kind of give the audience a little bit more of a framework. So with indirect perception, it's like, hey, I'm looking for specific clues, right? So if I'm playing hockey or basketball, like I'm waiting for a specific actor, right, or person or athlete to do something specific, which is then I'm going to see, right? So I see what they're doing, then I'm going to decide what I'm going to do, and then I'm going to act, right? That's how information processing works, right? Within the ecological framework, there's what's called direct perception, right? So direct perception basically is this idea that I don't need to look for clues, right? It basically takes this idea that perception and action, right? So when I'm like acting and perceiving, those are inherently linked, right? I'm not perceiving and then acting. It's like as I'm doing both, that's kind of more of a direct perception, right? I'm not looking for clues. I'm just moving in relation to my environment more specifically, as opposed to kind of looking for specific clues to then make an action on, like comparatively to that. Now, once that perception action happens, right, as it's happening, right, I'm using that cognitive phase that you said, that cognition phase, right, to effectively like do something based on it, right? But the biggest thing I think between the two of those things is that like when I think about information processing, a lot of it for me is like when you look at it from a framework, it sounds a little bit silly, right? So like if I was going to throw a ball to you, and if you had to basically see the ball was coming, then decide that you were going to catch it in a certain way, and then actually act and do that, by the time that you did all those things, the ball would hit you in the face. You know what I mean? Like that's just like what's going to happen, right? So to say that like, you know, I can perceive and act in the same time, and then there's principles called tau, which is basically like time to contact. And I won't get kind of like super in the depth with that right now, but it's just all these principles that kind of inherently show that this direct perception is real, right? It's that perception action is actually coupled. And then from there, like that's going to be a lot different when it comes to like building practice design and, you know, training that as a skill. Like a lot of times in specific practice settings, that skill's never developed or it's inherently removed. But we can kind of get into that a little bit later.
When you talk, thanks for the clear information. When we now talk about, you mentioned the game situation. Let's say in ice hockey, you have the puck, you enter the zone, defender is stepping up. Now you have to make a move, you have to skate around him, etc. How do you can bring that now to the off ice setting to really learn the skill, to refine it, to make it automatic, that you then can use it in game in real time, like you said, without like thinking, because then maybe the opponent poke checks the puck out of you or hits you or whatever.
Yeah. So I think one of those things that like a lot of the, like when it comes to like the skill acquisition space, like I think it inherently can be mainly utilized in the actual practice setting, right? So when I go, like, if I want to work on that specifically, I'm probably going to work on that on the ice specifically, right? So the biggest thing with sports is a lot of sports are very relationship based, right? So you have the offender and the defender, right? So when we look at how like sports tend to be traditionally approached, right, from a practice standpoint, let's just say, like to your point, that skill, right, that we're looking at, I'm going to take that skill, and then what I'm going to do is decompose it into parts. right? So maybe I'm going to work on stick handling, maybe I'm going to work on skating, maybe I'm going to work on like specific moves with the defender, right? If that kind of makes sense. So it's like each kind of component, right? And then what I'm going to do at the end is I'm like, now I'm going to mash all those parts together and hope that that specific skill improves, right? The
Mm-hmm.
problem though is when I work on stick, let's say I'm doing stick work by myself, or I'm doing skating work by myself, or I'm working like on like maybe a move around a cone or like a pole or whatever ends up being.
Right.
I've taken away the actual perception action that we talked about before, right? If
Mm-hmm.
I'm working on my relationship with a defender, right, and it's like I need to work on like what's called the defender's affordances, right? So what is this person's invitations to act? Are they someone that's really fast, right? If they're really fast, then they can probably skate at a certain angle and keep up with me if I'm really fast. If they're really slow, then maybe they want to approach me more in a one-on-one situation because they're more physical or whatever ends up being. Like they're going to
Mm-hmm.
have certain things that they either like are more, incentivized to do based on their skill set, right, or their kind of affordance, right? And there's other things that they may not want to do because they don't have that specific skill set developed, right? So when we look at actually training these things, what we want to do is try not to like eliminate the actual situation that we're looking to improve, right? So if I go back to that example of, like, hey, we break this down in 3 parts, at no point is there an actual like element where I'm working against another human being, right? It's just like, hey, I'm working on skill work, I'm working on skating, like I'm doing all these things that, again, theoretically, there's this idea that like I'm getting better at all of these parts, but it's like I've taken the actual skill itself and then I've actually not representative of that at all, right? So
Yep.
when we look at representative practice design, right, which is something within kind of an ecological framework here, what we want to do, and I like to use this analogy, I didn't come up with this. I forget who did, so credit to whoever came up with it. But it's basically you want to take a slice of cake, right? So if I take a cake, it's my birthday, right? I cut a slice out of it. I have all of the pieces of it, right? Let's just say it's like, an ice cream cake, right? So there's like frosting, then there's cake, then there's ice cream, then there's cake, whatever, right? There's every single component of the cake is in that slice specifically, if that makes sense. What traditionally is done from a skill development standpoint is they take the ingredients of the cake, right? So it's the sugar, the flour, the eggs, right? It's like I take each one of those things and I try to develop those. But then the problem is like I've developed all those things, but I don't have the actual cake itself, right? If I'm building a practice, right, or a skill specific thing or a practice, I want to work on something specifically, right? I want to take the actual ingredients of the game, right? I want to take the element of like, hey, there's defenders in the game, right? There's a time limit in the game, right? So there's like, there's a shot clock in certain things, there's certain dimensions, right? And again, this is something where like I want to add elements to this. And it's not to say, right, because a lot of times people will hear that and then they go, hey, like, well, why don't you just practice the game? Like, why don't you just play the game all the time, right? But there's certain elements that you want to keep in the game, right? So you can also take those things and you can adjust some of the rules and do things like that. But like what I don't want to do is just completely remove elements from the game and never actually work on the relationships between the players and all the actual pieces of that cake that are kind of there as opposed to the other parts, if that kind of makes sense.
It does 100%, and it's a pretty good example to really show how important it is to stick stick your ingredients in that case, or keep them together. But you can still work on those different kind of areas, but not to completely pull it apart, because then you're not training for game-like situations, for example. Yeah, for sure. Do you think that's one of a big pitfall for coaches, that they only practice some certain things or some certain areas of the game and not look at into like the whole aspect and look at all those principles? This podcast is presented by Like Me, your partner for social media and online marketing from Weiden, and Praxis im Salzhaus, your contact for physiotherapy and health in Altenstadt.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is this is just my philosophy for things, right? Like, I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of been like historically a lot of like really good coaches, who've done things in a quote unquote like traditional way or kind of done this what's called path dependency. It's like, hey, my coach did this before me, so I'm going to do the same thing, whatever. And it's like I'm not going to go and stand and say that, hey, like some of the best coaches of all time were not the best coaches they could be because they didn't do this, right? I think that's kind of crazy to say that. But like just from my standpoint, I think a lot of it is like kind of once it's like you peel the wool away from your eyes. There's a lot of different expressions, or it's like, once you see the light to something, it's like, it just makes a little bit more sense, right? It just kind of is like, hey, like this makes more sense to me in doing some of that. But I do think a lot of times coaches don't have a real deep understanding for why they're choosing to do the things they do, right? So it's kind of like, hey, like we're going to do these things, but it's like I don't really understand the science basis or the rationale or whatever, and it's like, or whatever they've taken, right? Like it's just the stuff that quote unquote they've always done or whatever. It's like they've never really challenged or thought about it to a super deep extent of like, why are we choosing to do those things? Right. So it's like I remember working with the team years ago, and it's like they would just stand in lines and they would pass this ball back and forth over and over again. And it's like, again, like this is a very like rudimentary skill. There's not a lot of like transfer to this to actual sport from a standpoint of like you're almost never passing a ball back and forth like in a game without defenders or doing whatever, but it's something that was like pretty consistently done. Right. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's like, again, it's part of the culture, right? We've done this for a long time or whatever, but it's like, okay, like, but why are we doing that? Like, do we think this creates inherent benefit for us? Yes or no? And so I think a lot of times there's kind of that element of it. And I think a lot of coaches are just like either they've seen some success, right? So it's like, hey, I've been successful, so I'm just going to keep doing some of the things that I've always done. Or they're just kind of afraid to try new things, right? Because like being a coach, there's obviously like a lot of, if I win more games, I'm probably going to get more money, right? So if I
Yeah, yeah.
lose games because I try something new, then it's like I could lose my job or I'm afraid of how this is going to go or whatever. And just real quick, I think like one of the really cool examples of somebody who was successful, but then also implemented a lot of these things is this guy. His name is John Mayer. So he's the head coach at Loyal Marymount University in California. So he's the head beach volleyball coach there. And he
Mm-hmm.
was someone that was very successful with that program, but then decided to work with under ecological framework, focus more on skill acquisition, that kind of stuff. And not only was that program continued to be really successful, they actually like had their best season ever last year where they were the runners up for the national championship. So it's just kind of cool to see that people have like who have been successful. Again, I think, I think it's a little bit easier, right? When you've already been successful to kind of try
Yeah,
something new. But,
yeah.
I think it's cool when people are like, hey, like, why don't I try something different? Or why do I even if I don't want to try it in this framework, it's like, why don't I try to get up under understanding of like why I'm doing the things that I'm doing? Because I think at the end of the day, if people looked in the mirror, they would really be like, well, I don't actually know. It's just like, this has always been the way I've done it, or, insert, explanation here,
Yeah. Do you think you can approach every athlete, or let's say also in maybe a youth development program, in the same way when they have varying backgrounds or different kind of resources they can use? Obviously, still in the topic of learning skills or skill acquisition, not in like general training principles, like about this topic, if it makes sense.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
It's so there's a big kind of debate in the skill acquisition community, if you will, about like what's
Hmm.
called the fundamentals, right? So it's always like, hey, we need to learn the fundamentals first. This is a big thing that, people who know way more than me about this stuff kind of talk about. And they say like, is this something that's really necessary? Like, do I really need to learn if I'm a soccer player, do I really need to learn how to like dribble about around a cone in a square a bunch of times, right? Efficiently before I can actually am prepared to go play the sort like actually soccer itself, right? And so some of the research, and like Rob Gray's put out a lot of stuff in his books about these different things and whatever, but a lot of the research has indicated that no, you inherently don't need to do that, right? There's research that indicates that it's like, hey, this really prescriptive activity, right? So it's like this group does the dribble around the cone a bunch of different times and whatever, and then you have this other group that just either plays sport or does something that's like less formally structured or less prescriptive or less like internally focused, right? So not as focused on the body or whatever. And you basically have these two, groups, and like a majority of the time, right, in these studies anyway, there's been improvement typically in both groups, right, because you're kind of practicing the skill, but there's been a either like quicker like learning rate or a higher score on the whatever the exam or like way they tested from pre and post for these groups that kind of utilize some of these different theories, right? So I think when it comes down to it, it's kind of like, do we think that the fundamentals are effectively super important? Are they kind of a prerequisite to do things? I don't think they necessarily are, right? I do think there's this concept of what's called task simplification, right? So when you have athletes who are growing up, right, it's kind of like they're all like, developing physically, right? They're different heights, different sizes, do different things, right? A lot of what sports are mandated for are built for adults, right? So it's like if
Hmm.
I'm a 6-year-old kid and I'm trying to swing an adult tennis racket, it's probably going to feel really awkward because the racket's almost as big as me, right?
Yeah.
So there's task simplification and there's like actually scaling to different things that probably needs to happen, right? So I think when we talked about earlier, right, with the cake analogy of, hey, like, instead of like working on the ingredients, right, what if we actually just make the actual game simpler, but we keep the game consistent, right? So you
Yeah.
see this a lot with like kids, right? It's like, hey, if I'm playing soccer, right, there's the little nets for the kids, right, versus the big net. Or I'm, working with tennis and they have those kind of softer balls for kids. So it makes them easier to hit, right? I think a lot of that stuff is inherently a lot more effective, right, than trying to essentially just do the same thing over and over and over again. And I've actually, again, like this is anecdotal, but I've seen some of this stuff. Like I remember when I worked with Casey at some of our volleyball camps and doing some of those things, I remember watching some athletes who, like, they came in, they were pretty new to the sport, they didn't have a huge skill set, and most of our activities at camp were like playing focus. It's like we weren't just sitting there and like setting the ball a bunch of times or passing the ball a bunch of times. It was like, hey, like let's actually play, like 6-on-6. Let's do some queen of the court. Let's do things though where it's like you have to pass and set and hit and attack and do all these different things. And it was cool to watch some of these like very underskilled players, right, develop like in real time. Like it's like
Mm-hmm.
from where they were in the beginning to the end, just because they had to do something in a real life scenario, right? It's like they had an actual objective. They had to interact with other people, right? Like I remember distinctly one girl was like, she was very poor at passing, right? So after the ball gets served, she like would kind of always shank the ball or miss the ball. But it's like the other team served her a lot because they knew that it may be an easy way to get points,
Yeah.
right? But then eventually this girl over time, like she was actually able to start to return the ball so that her setter could do something with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you see that over now. If we just like basically, if I just like thrown the ball to her a bunch of times and I was like, here, just pump it straight up every single time, it's like, does that girl get better in the game like situation? Maybe, maybe not, but I would argue probably not, right? So I think a lot of it is just like, how can we actually simplify the tasks, simplify the games, but kind of keep it as representative as possible, even for like the younger kids as they're developing. But you can do that across the board, even in college. Like I remember in the same thing, we would do a lot of, hey, we want to work on some of the mechanical changes we're trying to get from volleyball, right? We're trying to work on this like big cycle motion with the arm and shoulder because we think it's a little bit healthier, if that makes sense,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to kind of just rotating the arm down and kind of like a piking motion. And so like, hey, we dropped the net down. So we put the net a little bit lower and it was like, hey, like it's easier for our girls to hit over a lower net and they don't have to worry about just trying to like actually hit the ball into the court. And we just made the task a little bit simpler, right? It's like we're still working on doing things. And again, we know that's not exactly what we would want to do all the time. Like when we go play in a real game in a real tournament, like the net's at a certain height. But if we're trying to work on specific things, it's like instead of just being like, all right, like let's hit into an empty wall or do things over and over and over again, like let's actually work on something that's a little bit more representative of what we're actually trying to do, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I have something to add or some question regarding your yeah, you can kind of say like the success story of your volleyball team you just mentioned. You have to, if I'm not mistaken, but I'm pretty sure that you will confirm that, always keep on practicing then those situations. Could be on the one hand just basic drills, but on the other hand also the game situations, to keep that skill and to maintain it and to keep improving on that, if I'm not mistaken. Because if you stop practicing it, obviously you will then make like a downward spiral, kind of, that you not unlearn it, but it always obviously gets harder again. If does it make
Yeah,
sense what I'm trying to say?
yeah, I think so.
That you
I
have to
think
keep on doing and keep on practicing, so you keep that skill and it really gets like into your head and just like automatic. You don't have to think about what you're doing. You get the ball in the volleyball example. You know where your players are. You know where you have to play it. And if you don't practice that for a long time, then you might get set back again.
yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of like any skill, right? So any skill to
Yeah.
the point that it's like, the less you train the skill, typically, you're not going to see as much return on investment from that standpoint.
Yeah.
But I do think, to your point though, it's a little bit tough where for me, like with the kind of like muscle memory stuff for me, like I just struggle with that concept a little bit just because to that point, it's always a different situation, right? So I want to say it was either Roger Federer or like Rafa Nadal like talked about this in one of Rob Gray's books. Like it was a quote, and they talked about how every single shot that they play, right? These guys have hit thousands of tennis shots, right? They're someone who theoretically, quote unquote, would have a ton of muscle memory, right? They've played the game way longer than most people at a high level, like higher level than most people, all these different things. But realistically, every single shot that they play is different, right? If like Rafa is playing against me, who is very bad at tennis, right? Like those shots probably he doesn't have to hit the same way that if he's playing against, Djokovic or some of these, like top rated guys in the country, right? But the thing though is it's like, where are you at in the year, right? If I'm playing at the French Open, is the surface different than if I'm playing at Wimbledon, right? What time of year is it, right? How fatigued am I? So I recently have a injury history of like, hey, I'm coming back from injury, so I'm working on some things and whatever and that kind of thing. So I think realistically, like, yes, like there is an element of like you've done a lot of things before, but again, the skill itself is not like, it's not a program, right? So when we go back to kind of the beginning of the conversation today, we talked about that information processing where it's like I see something, decide, act versus the ecological dynamics. A lot of it is it's like, to that point though, it's the specific skill I'm good at, right? Like I've practiced setting a lot. And I think a lot of times, like when you talk about development and then understanding what skill is, like you need to understand the skill you're actually trying to do, right? So if I talk about setting, which is like one of my favorite things to talk about, there's this really cool thing about setting is because it's an interaction between two people, right? You have your setter, right? And then you have your attacker, right? Obviously, and you could go down the line and say there's more interactions with like the passer and all these things and whatever, because volleyball is a very interactive game. But this cool thing about setting is that it's a mutual relationship, right? It's on both the setter and the hitter to find a balance to make what's called rhythm, right? Rhythm is basically, it's not even like, the cool thing about it is it's more of like a feeling. It's like when you feel like the ball is just right where you want it to be, like the setter has made it as easy as possible for the hitter is totally comfortable to jump as high as they can, hit it as hard as they can, wherever they want to hit it. And it's this kind of like really special thing, right? So that's not something that like effectively you get from just repeating the same rep over and over and over again, right? It's this feeling, right? It's this kind of sentiment, if you will, right? And so to kind of on the flip side of things, this is the opposite of when people like in basketball, for example, it's like, hey, like, let's go into the gym and I want you to make 100 free throws before you leave the gym. This is a very common place, and at least from what I've seen, another place like, get your shots up to whatever. And it's called repetition with repetition, right? So I'm just doing the same concept over and over and over. I'm trying to find this quote unquote ideal technique. I'm trying to find the one thing I can do over and over and over again. But realistically, we know, like I talked about already with the tennis example, that it's like every single shot is going to be a little different, right? If I'm a basketball player and the shot that I'm having in like a game with just my buddies is going to be way different than if I'm playing for the national championship on the line, even if it's exactly the same position, same movement, whatever. From that standpoint, there's different psychological factors, environmental factors, like all these different things. And I think the thing that's really cool about this, when you look at actual skill acquisition, is that it takes into account all of these concepts, right? It's not just like, hey, it's the same thing over and over again, right? Now, there's obviously some intangibles and things like that are going to be, there's different what's called attractor states, and there's some people with different theories about different attractor states and, kind of universal things to look for. But realistically, like, it's going to be so different person to person, and it's always going to be so different within the context of every specific situation.
Yeah. It's a very interesting example you mentioned with the tennis players or the different environments, if I put it this way. Also the basketball one, because that's actually true. And I thought about, because like I mentioned you before, you work in ice hockey. I wouldn't say there isn't a lot of environmental changes because you play in a rink every time, but also with the fans, if you have a home game, if you have an away game, and so on and so on. So it's very, very interesting how that plays into the performance or into the skills that you then want to use. In my case, on the ice, or in your case on the tennis court, in your example. Rob, I really want to talk a lot longer with you today, but I think we could definitely make some topics happen for a second episode if you're interested. I have one or two more questions to you. I know I asked you that, I think, when we first got in touch together off air, but I'm really interested in maybe one or two books or articles about the skill acquisition. If you have something on the top of your head, I would really appreciate if you could share that with us.
And, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say I'd also, I'm happy to come on a second episode and
Would love to.
talk to everybody again for sure. Yeah, I think as far as skill acquisition goes, I think for me there's a lot of like kind of big names that pop in, but like the first one's going to be Rob Gray. So Rob Gray is a professor at Arizona State University. He also does skill acquisition in Major League Baseball. So he does a lot of his own specific research. But I think the really cool thing about Rob is that he's written multiple books. Like I think he's got like 5 or 6 now out, and it's just a lot of his kind of introducing the concepts to people. And it's just a really easy read, right? Like I've read some of the other skill acquisition theory, some of the other like, articles and do things. And it's just kind of tough. There's a lot of like big words and fancy things, and it's like very in the weeds and that kind of stuff. And like, I think after you've kind of gotten a good sense of things, it's easier to understand. But Rob does a really nice job of like writing. It just feels like someone's telling you a story, right? It's just a very easy understanding. So the first kind of books that he has is How We Learned to Move. Is kind of his staple book. You guys can get that. I think it's on Amazon. It's kind of all over the place from that standpoint. Rob also has his own podcast, which is the Perception Action podcast, right? We talked about perception action coupling earlier, but those are definitely good places to start. I know like if people are like interested, like I have my own podcast, which is called Hot Takes Performance Podcast. There's also a couple other people I'd recommend, which is like Keith Davids is a great researcher. Marianne Davies does stuff. Alex Arama works in the basketball community, which has done a lot more overseas. He actually like was in England, and then he works now with the Cavaliers in the NBA. So he's done a lot of cool things. There's also a podcast that I've been on, which is called the Adaptable Athlete Podcast, which is done by a company called Emergence. And then there's another podcast, which is called the Coach Your Brains Out Podcast, which is done by John Mayer, who I actually mentioned earlier in the episode. But there's a lot of resources. I think just, quick Google search will obviously help people, but I think a lot of it is just, it can be very jarring, right? It can be really tough to kind of dive into it. And I think like I always recommend to people start with Rob Gray. And, if you're not sold from there, then, don't talk to me because I'm not getting your money back, but, like maybe reach out to Rob and he can help you out with that. But yeah.
Yeah, I'll try to sum up everything and put it in the podcast description down below. One more thing before we wrap it up, a closing thought from you, what you would give my listeners or professional athletes that might listen to, like maybe to something to take away from this episode, from the skill acquisition point of view, to learn or to so they close this episode and they take one thing away.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, and I actually tell this to my athletes all the time, is like just ask a lot of questions. Like I think it's really going to be helpful for like if you're a professional athlete or you're a coach or you're an athlete or whoever's listening to this. Like I think the biggest thing that you can do is try to create a rationale for like why you're doing the things that you do. And like when it comes to like sports performance and sports science, like there's easy ways to rationalize everything. I could rationalize something that doesn't even make sense because like in my head, I found some connection or whatever. But I think that's actually the opposite of the problem of what we have a lot of times in society. I think a lot of people, it's like, hey, I've just done this way, or I'm going to do this or whatever. But I've never really understood like why I'm doing this, or I've never really kind of thought about like, if I was going to do something that wasn't this, what would be the alternative, right? So if you're a professional athlete, ask your strength coach, ask your skills coach, right? Ask them why you're doing the things. Ask them why you're doing the things that you're doing, right? What's the reason? What are we trying to get out of this? Is there a better alternative to this? Like why we're doing this thing versus the other thing? And I think it's really going to help you create understanding because human beings aren't robots, right? I think that's kind of like what I've alluded to a ton in this, but I think the biggest thing is like the more understanding you can create for yourself. And I've seen this at people at the highest level. It's like, they need to be able to make the decisions for themselves, and they have to be able to kind of decide and do the things that they firmly believe in. And I think like if you want to work at the highest level and you want to be the most successful, you can't just turn a blind eye to things. You can't just trust that things are going to make sense or whatever. You really have to build this complex understanding of a lot of different areas, and the best coaches and athletes and people that I've seen actually invest in all the areas that they're like looking into, and that's what makes them really great. So that would be kind of my anecdotal note for everybody there.
That's a good one to wrap it up. Yeah, for sure. Rob, thank you so much for hopping on my show. Like I said, time difference, work schedule, it's always hard to make it happen, but I'm glad that we had time to talk today a little bit. I learned a lot, and I hope that some of my viewers, listeners gathered some more insights, some more information about that very, very interesting topic. So thank you again for joining me. Like I said, I would love to talk to you again in the near future. And all the best with your podcast, with your work. And I will talk to you soon for 100%.
Yeah, that sounds great. Always down for round 2 here. So thank you, and I appreciate you having me on.
Would love to talk again. Thank you, Rob. Take care. Thanks for listening to the show. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow the podcast, leave a rating or comment, and share it with someone who loves sports science. And for more content, follow me on Instagram at science_in_sports_. See you in the next episode.